So, I've got this great new master and I want to do everything for him. It feels so good when he beats the shit out of me. I love him so much and I'm so high that I want more.
I got this great new girl and I'm getting to do everything I ever wanted to. I've always had sadistic fantasies and now I can let them all out. I'm going to carve my initials into her, brand her, and make her sleep chained to the toilet.
And to think, we only met Tuesday. He was the most abusive person ever. He pushed me into so much more than I was ready for. He should have known not to leave scars there. Now I can't go to the pool and my relatives are ready to call the police. He abused me mentally. He didn't care about me as a person.
Worst slave ever. She presented herself as being a true slave, but she didn't have a slave heart. She claimed she wanted all these extreme things, but when I did them, she suddenly went all cold and betrayed and abandoned me. This always happens. Hi, I'm James Gordon.
And I'm Rebecca Dahl.
Welcome to VMAP. We're here to talk about power exchange. If you've never heard of power exchange, you may have heard some other term like master and slave or dominant and submissive. Because those words can have very different and sometimes emotional context depending on your experience, or just seem like a poor fit for what you do or want, we use power exchange as a general term. Power exchange isn't a new concept, and it's been popularized by dozens of books over the past 100 years. Some better written than others.
And most of what comes from books and movies is incomplete, or an outright myth.
In the next 10 minutes, we'll see
an overview of power exchange, including basic terminology and what power exchange is and isn't.
A short history showing how power exchange was a norm in the past, and why modern power exchange is very different.
Some myths about power exchange that make us seem very foolish if we don't know the truth behind them.
More terms for talking about and understanding modern power exchange.
And finally, a few warnings and one big pitfall that destroys a lot of power exchange relationships. Before we start, one thing to get clear. When we use the word slavery, we aren't using it in the traditional sense. It's sort of like the word crusade. Nobody living today would expect someone described in the news as a crusader to wear armor, pin a cross to their clothing, or ransom villagers at sword point.
The traditional bad kind of slavery still exists, even though it's prohibited by the UN Declaration of Human Rights and causes millions of people from Kansas to Mumbai untold pain and suffering. Modern slavery is often called human trafficking, and what we're talking about has nothing to do with it. Human trafficking is a bad thing, and if you want to help stamp it out or know anyone you suspect is involved, we recommend you contact the National Human Trafficking Resource Center.
Master-slave and dominant-submissive relationships are often called MS and DS. The specifics of the individual relationship are sometimes called dynamics, and a couple might refer to our dynamic to mean the particular structure of our relationship.
Some people use the terms top and bottom only in a very limited sense. We use them as a general term to distinguish the power roles, because they're self-explanatory and easy to understand. We don't have to go through a catalog of terms like master, mistress, dominant, daddy, mommy, etc. There are numerous authorities that give rules about the dynamics of MS or DS, either implicitly through stories and books or explicitly in the form of a list of slave rules or slave contracts.
So, what's the authority for these rules?
Well, mostly the authors made them up based on what they liked.
So, why would we want to live by someone else's rules?
Well, sometimes a really good author came up with a really good idea, and we want to copy it because it's kinda hot. But way too often, people obey these rules because they think they're doing it right, and often they end up pretty miserable.
This series isn't about giving you a set of rules. It's about how to figure out a power exchange that works for you. Let's start by talking about where power exchange comes from and what makes it different from a traditional relationship.
So, in the past, the roles of men and women tended to be dictated by society. The rise of the modern era brought advances in industry, communication, philosophy, and ethics, which led to humans having much more freedom to choose what they did.
For reasons that have been studied, debated, and filled entire books, these changes weren't enjoyed equally by everyone, especially men and women. In Western society, middle-class women were constrained to narrow roles in the home or a few acceptable outside jobs, though of course lower-class women still had to work hard as laborers.
Not surprisingly, most people would rather be middle class instead of laborers, so being constrained to the home became a token of success that most women aspired to as a sign that they had made it. New members of the middle class tried very hard to conform in order to be accepted, and while a few wealthy people flaunted the rules, most felt a crushing pressure from society to conform.
In summary, throughout human history, most relationships, including marriage, involved some degree of what we'd recognize today as power exchange. Usually, the roles were defined by custom, and those who violated them, and there were always violators, were given unsavory labels like shrew.
Now times have changed. While each in its time was seen as a harbinger of doom, democratic government, the rise of the middle class, universal suffrage, careers for women, labor-saving home technology, divorce, contraception, same-sex marriage, and polyamory all mean that modern people, particularly women, have a lot more choice in how they live their lives. Everyone can have a career or be a ruler in their own home. This means that almost everyone has to do some negotiating. Unfortunately, there's no class in school that prepares adults for the challenge of working out the details of their relationship with another adult.
We pretend that historical models or examples out of 2-hour movies provide a basis for building relationships. But of course, they aren't much more use than the fiction books we mentioned at the beginning. Modern people have different lives than people a century ago. Even if we wanted to roll back the hands of the clock, the relationship wouldn't fit our lifestyle.
Modern ideals of relationships champion equality. Most of us who want to be modern and progressive feel a pressure to live in the most egalitarian way possible. The problem is, just as not everyone wants to build a career outside the home, many people don't enjoy the responsibility of being in charge.
Every relationship has some exchange of power and authority, because each partner gives up some authority over their lives in return for the security and assurance of being with the other. But we don't really think of it as power exchange, unless there's dynamics that result in one partner having substantially more authority, some or all the time. Power exchange isn't for everyone. Some people prefer the fluidity of a less defined relationship, and even within power exchange, some have strict rules while others have more flexibility in give and take.
If you like to be the one in charge, power exchange may work for you because you accept more responsibility in exchange for having more authority.
If you like having a set of structured rules and not being responsible for the big picture, power exchange may work for you because you give up some authority in exchange for having less responsibility.
Myth number 1. People who want to take the top role in power exchange are naturally dominant, while those who take the bottom role are naturally submissive.
Some people have very dominant personalities and choose to take the follower role at home, while others who aren't very assertive outside the home would prefer to have a structure that places them in charge without a struggle.
In our modern times, most adults need to be somewhat responsible, and even if one partner supposedly has absolute authority over the other, usually the other needs to be able to make some decisions.
In novels, power exchange often works because the controlling partner is very rich, and so can make things happen effortlessly, relieving the submissive partner of any responsibility. Unfortunately, most of us have more realistic lives with school, jobs, children, and other relationships.
Clashes and difficulties in any relationship usually come about when one partner wants to have more authority without taking a fair share of responsibility. In traditional relationships, this often comes from imitating an old, impractical model. In power exchange, it often comes from imitating fictional books or movies that people have never actually had to live out, and these often center on myths about power exchange that are at best only half true.
Our second myth. Men are naturally dominant, and women are naturally submissive.
This myth really causes a lot of trouble. It doesn't help that it's the theme of a well-known set of books, which were early and accessible source material for people who fetishize the idea of power exchange. It makes many people not want to take power exchange seriously, and gives a lot of people who do some very confused ideas.
Why do we think this myth came about? Likely because for hundreds of years, women who accepted the submissive role were lionized and quoted, while women who didn't were often marginalized, made fun of, or silenced. At the same time, men who want to take a submissive role were and are often shamed and ridiculed for it. It isn't that there aren't submissive women and dominant men, it's just that they're only half the story.
And even people who are submissive within a relationship may not be submissive at work or socially. Beyond that, let's not forget that many men and women seek same-gender partners, and that there are a lot of different sexual orientation and gender identities, which Hank Green explains better than I ever will in this video. One piece of advice: if you're a heterosexual man and want to make a fool of yourself, assume that any woman you meet is submissive. If you want to step that up to being a real asshat, go up to women who present as dominant and tell them that at heart they must be truly submissive.
Power exchange relationships come in many forms. Here are just a few of the many dynamics we've encountered, and we'll take a closer look at different relationship models later in the series.
The term polyamory was coined in a 1990 magazine article by Otter Zell and spread over Usenet in the early 1990s. Like most other terms in this spirit, nobody agrees on a strict definition, but in practice, poly is used for any relationship in which people have more than one partner.
Many people who practice power exchange are monogamous, but it's also the case that a lot aren't. Having multiple people in relationships can be chaotic, and power exchange is often a way of mapping and legitimizing the lines of control and authority that are present in most relationships.
People who don't know much about power exchange or are just getting started often have fantasies about collecting harems. Now, there are no formal limits to the number of people or lines of authority in a power exchange dynamic, but in practice, maintaining more than 2 or 3 major relationships is extremely difficult, even for lifestylers who have experience, a supportive local community on their side, and can devote a lot of time and effort. Power exchange is not a collectible card game of partners.
Human beings need individual attention, and while some people do exercise authority over more than one person, it's not as common as you'd think. In the real world, having a seraglio of willing sex slaves is pretty rare. Most people want a handful of intimate relationships where they feel they are significant participants, no matter what their power exchange status. We don't deal in a lot of scare stories or warnings. We feel that the world of power exchange is scary enough, and we want to demystify it. We know that MS is generally safe, and that being into it doesn't mean you're mentally unhealthy. For example, a group of respected scholars conducted peer-reviewed research which showed that people in self-identified 24/7 sadomasochistic slave relationships were as mentally healthy or healthier than the population at large. Nothing about power exchange obligates anyone to put up with non-consensual abuse or neglect.
In our opening example, we saw how overcommitment can lead to a relationship that explodes or melts down.
While it's a lot more rare than the press would have us believe, there are individuals that use the framework of BDSM and power exchange to lure people into unhealthy situations of domestic abuse. But let's face it, there are a lot more people who use conventional marriage to do the exact same thing. And while the law doesn't create barriers to leaving a slave collar, divorce creates legal and property hurdles for someone who wants to leave an abusive spouse.
What's probably more common is co-abusive situations, where neither partner has the common sense to set limits, and both go further and harder in the first blush of excitement than they should.
Biological anthropologist Dr. Helen Fisher, a senior research fellow at the Kinsey Institute, has talked at length about the power of the chemicals that grip our brains when we're first involved in a new relationship.
At the risk of oversimplifying, in layman's terms, being caught up in strong relationship emotions can create chemical reactions that aren't too different from drug addiction. And for reasons we'll investigate in a later episode, power exchange may be one of the most powerful ways to tap those emotions. The takeaway is that you need to go slow and be responsible.
If you're the top, that means more than asking your partner if it's okay, or going along for the ride as they try to do everything at once at breakneck speed. One reason people may seek power exchange is that they aren't good at controlling their impulses, and they need someone who can be more restrained to help guide them. This means not doing everything that comes to mind just because they're willing to let you.
In this introductory episode, we covered
An overview of power exchange.
the fact that real slavery still exists, but modern power exchange has nothing to do with it.
And that there's no central authority or true way to do power exchange, so we can't tell you what's right for everyone, only explain the possibilities. We covered a short history of power exchange.
In summary, throughout human history, most people lived in power exchange relationships. However, the lines of those relationships were determined arbitrarily by society and economic need, rather than by choice. Now everyone can choose to be in charge, but that doesn't mean everyone wants to.
In looking at 3 myths, we learned that neither history nor fiction really make good models.
We also learned that what role someone takes in power exchange doesn't necessarily mirror how they behave socially or at work.
And we saw that the idea that men are dominant and women submissive is an illusion brought about by social pressure which downplayed dominant women and marginalized submissive men.
We covered terms that people use to describe power exchange.
We learned that MS and DS are common terms, though there is no universal agreement on what those roles look like. We also learned that individuals use a wide variety of terms to characterize their relationships.
We saw that while many people use top and bottom in a very limited sense, they can also be used as generic terms to describe the roles within power exchange, and that's how we use them.
We learned that dynamics is a term used to describe what goes on in a power exchange.
And that polyamory is a term for relationships that have more than 2 partners.
We learned that power exchange, even when it includes sadomasochism, hasn't been found to be dangerous or a sign of bad mental health.
We reminded you that abuse can exist within any relationship, and power exchange is no exception, though it's no more likely. If you're concerned your relationship may be abusive and want to talk to someone or get help, see the notes after this episode or our episode 4, which is all about consent.
Finally, we caution that any relationship can involve nearly overpowering emotions, and that power exchange may tend to amplify that, which means all partners, especially tops, should go slow and use common sense. For VMAP, I'm Rebecca Dahl.
And I'm James Gordon.
Remember, there's no right way in power exchange.
Only your way.